In this nugget, you and I are going to do some great review of group types, and we're also going to look at group nesting, and we're going to take a look at Microsoft's best practices when it comes to using all these different types of groups. This is a hands-on lab nugget, so launch the lab now and follow along if you can. When we were creating groups in earlier nuggets, we saw that these groups could be domain local, they could be universal, they could be global. And we also saw that there were two different types of groups. There were the security groups and there were the distribution groups. Remember, distribution groups are special type. They're only used for email type situations. What our focus is the security groups. So Microsoft tells us an acronym, a memory aid that we can use to help use these groups the way it would be most scalable and most effective in a large enterprise. They say that our accounts should go into global groups, and then global groups can go inside of universal groups, and then universal groups can go inside of domain local groups, and we assign our permissions to those domain local groups. If we structure it this way, the scalability and the usability of our security model is going to be really, really powerful. Now, if you don't have multiple domains, you would skip the universal group concept because you don't need universal groups, as we'll see in a moment, if you don't have multiple domains in your forest. So it would be even simpler. It would just be AGDLP under that model. But we'll focus on a multi-domain model because if you can do that, you can do anything, obviously. So first up is this concept of the account, the user account, going into a global group. Let's review some stuff about these global groups. For membership in the global group, it would be user accounts from the same domain as the parent global group. Remember, we could put one global group inside another global group. So certainly membership could be global groups from the same domain as the parent global group. And technically, these global groups can be assigned permissions in any domain, but remember, we're not going to assign permissions to them under this model. We're going to be assigning the permissions to the domain local group. Now, what about conversion? That's one of our exam objectives, and we could take a global group and we could convert it to a universal group if we wanted to, as long as it's not a member of any other global groups when we attempt to do this conversion. I'll show you the conversion, and I'll show you how all of this works inside of our lab in a moment. So to review, the big point here is global groups are so often going to be containing our user accounts from the domain that we are working in. So per the memory aid, where do those global groups that we just looked at go? They would be placed in universal groups in a large forest environment with many domain trees, or even a multi-forest environment where we're creating trusts between the different forests. The universal group can include as members accounts from any domain within the forest, global groups from any domain within the forest, and universal groups. What do we often put in them, of course? We typically put global groups inside of the universal group per our AGUDLP process. We can assign permissions to these things across any domain or forest, but understand, we're typically assigning the permissions, as we said, to the domain local group. Finally, these universal groups can be converted to domain local or global groups, but there is an exception here, and that is we can't have other universal groups inside our group when we go to convert it to a global. And so that brings us to our final step of the nesting of groups and that process, and that is the domain local group which gets the permission. It can have as members accounts from any domain, global groups from any domain, universal groups from any domain, and other domain local groups as long as those groups are in the same domain as the parent. We can assign permissions to these things, but only within the same domain as the parent domain local group, which makes sense. And by the way, this statement is really powerful now because it is where we tend to assign the permissions. What would we have, by the way, as membership typically? Well, global groups if we're in a small environment, or universal groups if we're in that much larger environment. We can convert these to universal groups, but once again, only if the domain local group doesn't contain other domain local groups when we go to make that conversion. Now, I know that's an incredible amount of information we just covered, so I did create a post up at ajsnetworking.com for you on Windows Server Active Directory group scopes. So you could just search the blog on group scopes, for instance, and I lay all of that out for you and more information at that blog. So let's really make sure we understand how all of this would work in the graphical user interface. So in your hands-on lab, let's jump into DCNUG1 and log in, and we're going to, no surprise, the Active Directory Users and Computers interface. So let's launch Server Manager is one way to get there, and from the Tools menu, we'll choose that Active Directory Users and Computers. Inside of our directory, we have this testj user that we know we can play with. So let's create those additional groups and let's nest them and test all of this. We'll right click and we'll go to New, and we're going to create a group. What's the first step? What's the first group that we're going to create? Well, we're going to create a global group. It's probably no coincidence that that's the default group scope. And notice here's where we would set security or distribution. And we're going to create one called Florida Sales Execs. So we'll say FL underscore sales underscore execs. So this group is for taking our user accounts from our local domain, let's say, and gathering them all together. So we'll say OK to this, and then we'll double click this group and we'll go to members. And where do we add our user accounts? We add them to global groups. So we'll do a test and check the name to find our testj user. There it is. And we'll put that user inside of that group. So there we have it, the Florida Sales Execs group, and it is a security group of type global. Now, how do we convert from one group to another? Well, if we double click, notice we can take global groups and convert them to universal. We can't convert them to domain local, so sure enough, that's grayed out. That's how easy it would be to convert a group inside of your user interface. Now, keep in mind, we can be doing all of this in PowerShell as well, the creation, population, and conversion of these groups. So there's our Florida Sales Execs, and it's got its testj user account. Now let's pretend we're in a massive environment. And in a massive environment with multiple domain trees, maybe even multiple forests, we would want to create and utilize universal groups where appropriate. So we're going to go in, we're going to create a new group, and this universal group that we're going to be creating is simply the exec sales. Notice we had Florida executive salespeople, a group for that. Now we're doing just executive salespeople across all of the domain trees and forests. This will be a universal security group, and we say okay. Now, what goes inside of that universal group? Sure, the global groups as appropriate. So let's double click that exec sales group. And for members, this time we're not adding a user account. We are adding that Florida sales group, the global group we created. So I'll do a check on the name for FL. And there we go. The Florida sales execs is the global group that's inside of that universal group that we created. What's the last group type we create here? It's a domain local that will actually apply permissions to. So we'll do a new, we will do a group, and this one will be called, how about our Florida Sales Resources? Sure, it makes sense we would name this group after resources because it's here where we're going to be assigning permissions to resources. This is a domain local group that we are creating. What goes inside the domain local group? Well, we can place in a huge environment our universal group, can't we? So we'll go in and we'll say we want to add to this group the exec sales. So we'll check the name of exec. There it is. There's that universal group. Obviously, we could put global groups in here as well. That would make sense for those individuals in the local domain. We want to have access to these resources, but the universal group is added there as well for people outside of this domain or domain tree or even forest. So that's how scalable and cool you can build this structure. So let's test all of this stuff, shall we? Let's go down and grab our File Explorer. And in the File Explorer, what we're going to do is just go to the root of the C drive and let's create a new folder. And we'll simply call it sales-stuff. And inside the sales stuff folder, we will create a new important rich text document. How's that? Now, let's go back to sales stuff and let's do permissions here as we would in a real domain environment. First of all, we want to share this in our domain. And what we want to do for share permissions, as you might remember from best practices, is we would add the dynamic identity group of everyone, and we would give it full control. Now, this seems crazy, sharing it to everyone. But that's because we're going to lock down that universal share, if you will. We're going to lock that down by going into the NTFS security permissions and modifying those. So we always like to work in the advanced view, at least I do, and we see the individual permissions that are set up on this sales stuff folder. We're going to remove the everyone full control now from an NTFS perspective, and we're going to add a principal. And the principal that we're going to add, we'll do a search on Florida, for instance, and check the name. And it's going to show us, okay, we've got the Florida sales execs. That's the global group. But no, we want to assign it to the Florida sales resources domain local group because that's where we assign our permissions. And there we'll go ahead and give full control for that group, for example, and say okay. Say okay again, say close. And now we have set up the permissions both from a share perspective and an NTFS perspective for the appropriate domain local group. Well, guess what? We have Client Nug inside your lab. So click on Client Nug, and there's our test J user, and we're going to drop in the password and log in as that user. They should have full control on that resource. To review, the test J user account was placed in the appropriate global group, which was then placed in the appropriate universal group, which was then placed in the appropriate domain local group, which got the permissions. If we open up the File Explorer, we go to Network, we should see DC Nug 1. If we double click, there is the sales stuff share. If we open it up, there's the rich text document. They can modify all they want and save those changes thanks to the permissions they inherited through that group nesting structure that we built following Microsoft's best practices. So in this nugget, we took a look at those two types of groups. At least we discussed them, the security group and the distribution group. But more importantly, we looked at our domain local, our global, and our universal groups and really zeroed in on their scope. We saw how we nest these groups inside of each other in our permissions model. And we also saw how there could be the conversion of one group scope to another group scope if we ever needed to. And that would obviously be something that would rarely be done. I hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.